Schiit Audio promised that their products would be mostly upgradable. Now, excepting the small components such as these, which don't have any space for upgrade stuff to fit, they always promised that devices, at least from the kind of Bifrost size, would be upgradable in the future. And if you still have an older Bifrost, you still can upgrade it if there are upgrades available. But with the Bifrost 2, they have completely redesigned the DAC such that anything that was compatible before is not compatible now, down to the case even. So, with the Bifrost 2, they've made a number of very significant changes. For starters, it is now a balanced DAC. So instead of having to go up to a gungear to get a balanced DAC, you can actually get one of their balanced DACs for basically about 2/3 of the price. Also, to facilitate upgrades, they've made a number of big changes to the actual design. So now, instead of having something for upgrades you have to send back to Schiit Audio, they've made all the upgradable parts easily accessible by the user, with the two panels on the back which can be unscrewed and pulled out straight out from the back to replace either the analog board or the new USB board. So with the new USB, they've included Schiit Audio's new Unison USB. Now, the Generation 5 before had a significant upgrade from the Generation 3 that made it a better USB overall. One of the major issues with USB is not jitter, as many people say, but actually is noise. Our computers generate a lot of noise, USB processing generates a lot of noise, and that can get through to the analog circuits and affect the quality of the output. In search for a means of isolating the USB, they came across a very regular component. In fact, these Ethernet isolators are capable of passing through the high frequencies needed for USB isolation. And in my experience, that made a significant difference on my Yggdrasil when I upgraded it to the Analog 2, such that I was perfectly happy using USB as my main input, whereas before something like a good quality streamer would still provide maybe a better result. Now with the Unison USB, they've gone a step further. The Generation 5 USB used a C-Media USB processing chip for doing all its work. However, Mike Moffat, who in his kind of maybe you could say conservative attitude towards electronics was very against USB at the start, decided that if USB is going to be the standard, he's going to make a better USB. And the end result over a couple of years of research and experimentation has been the Unison USB. Now, instead of using a commercial chip like the C-Media chip, he programmed a PIC controller with his own USB implementation. And as well as using isolation chips to ensure that no noise gets through, his solution is entirely customized for audio USB input use. That USB input will accept input from computers, it'll accept input from smartphones and iPhones. So it's very versatile and it gets around a lot of the issues where with a commercial chip you might be stuck with whatever implementation they have or whatever firmware they have. Now to upgrade things like the firmware, that used to be something you had to send your DAC back to Schiit Audio for, and that became a problem if there were queues and you had to wait, and even if they said you could ship it, even if you were getting towards the beginning of the queue and you were due to ship it in, there was always going to be some wait without your DAC. And they got around this with an idea that's very clever. A lot of components use things where you put in an SD card and press a button and it upgrades your DAC. With the Bifrost 2, they've used a micro SD card slot where you'll be able to download any firmware upgrades from Schiit Audio, put it on the micro SD card, put it in, switch on your DAC, wait a few minutes, and it will self-upgrade. And that makes things a lot less hassle than having to fiddle with computers and software and drivers just to be able to get an upgrade onto your DAC. Now, I've upgraded so many components nowadays, I think this is a brilliant solution. Unfortunately, you can't upgrade old Bifrost to the new Bifrost as everything down to the chassis is completely new. But they are offering for at least a limited time a $100 discount if you previously bought through either them or one of their registered distributors an old Bifrost of any kind or any of the upgrades to the Bifrost. So I've had the Bifrost running in for about a week in my system, and as always, left it on for about 7 days and have been comparing it with primarily Schiit Audio's own Yggdrasil, and I've been plugging it into a variety of amps, good old Studio 6, Audio GD's Master 9, and even the Schiit Audio's Lear 3. And then I've got a fair idea of how it performs. My first early impressions were with the Studio 6 into a set of Empyreans, And it was, given I have good old Sylvania chrome top tubes in here, which tube rollers will understand what I mean when I talk about these, and the kind of warmer Empyreans, and this slightly warm sounding DAC, it meant for a very, very smooth and very mellow musical presentation. Now, I did most of my listening for evaluation through the Master 9, where I could A/B it very easily with the Schiit Audio's Yggdrasil. Now, since the Yggdrasil only has a Generation 5 USB, I have it plugged in via AES to this SoundAware D300 reference digital transport, which is probably about the best transport I've had here so far. So any differences between maybe the USBs are maybe negated by that, but all the same, I don't know how much of if it will make a very significant difference. It'll be interesting actually to see how much the Unison USB affects the Yggdrasil once it finally becomes available. But in that, I got some very clear impressions of the performance. I started as always with good quality music. Maybe one of the more recent ones I've listened to is Patricia Barber's Higher album, which is her latest album. It's not the best recording, but it is still a very good recording and has a lot of detail. Using that, the Bifrost came across as a very smooth, but actually quite detailed, reasonably detailed sounding DAC. Now, Schiit Audio has abolished the non-multibit version of the Bifrost, so it's just Bifrost 2 now. There's no regular Bifrost and there's no Bimby anymore. They're just one DAC. And for the $700 odd that they're asking for it, it actually came surprisingly close to the Yggdrasil in performance. Now, with higher quality recordings, there was a distinct jump up to the Yggdrasil, whereas things became more clearly defined. The soundstage became more spacious. You could hear more into the micro detail. The fine differences, say if an instrument string was plucked, you could hear the reverberations and how it affected other strings more clearly with the Yggdrasil. Switching back to the Bifrost 2, the sound became a little bit kind of rounder at the edges. Some of that fine micro detail was lost and became a slightly easier listen. If I switch down to say regular, say pop music, maybe a fairly good example of something I've listened to recently would be London Grammar. Now, London Grammar sounds great in my car, but through my system it's sort of like, this recording quality could be better. That's when the differences started to disappear. So, as I've always said, the quality of the music you listen to regularly has a huge bearing on the effect of what value you can actually get out of high-end gear. If you listen to regular pop and rock, often which is compressed or maybe not mastered to such a high standard, just less expensive gear is all you really need, in my opinion. More expensive gear will just reveal how much more distortion there is in the recording and will not get you any benefits. If you're like me and you like high quality recordings, you like the Chesky binaural stuff, and you want to hear how the singer's lips part over the microphone, you want to hear how the strings reverberations as the note decays affects the other strings in the piano or the guitar. That kind of ultra fine detail on very good recordings is stuff you really need the expensive gear to get the most out of. Now, the Bifrost 2, as a general listening DAC, it was as well as being quite smooth sounding, it was very natural in how it presented instruments such as piano and violin, which in general I had an impression, maybe a lot to do with the Unison USB, I'm not entirely sure, that the kind of overall lack of any kind of harshness or hardness or anything unpleasant in general when listening made the Bifrost 2 very nice to listen with in general. Kind of anything up above the mid-range, maybe there was a slight sense of bloom to the sound. I mean, something you really notice in the little Modi multi-bit, that you get a kind of bloomy distortion to the sound. There was still a touch of that with the Bifrost 2, especially kind of upper mid-range, maybe lower treble, and it's probably maybe more noticeable to me using the Focal Utopias, which are a little bit upper mid-strong. So that, of course, disappeared with the Yggdrasil. So that was the kind of picture I got from the Bifrost 2, is that it's a little bit kind of smooth around the edges, maybe a little bit bloomy in the kind of upper mid area, but generally is a really nice DAC to listen with. The single-ended out isn't so much of a compromise in Schiit Audio DACs as you might think. So I was thinking something like a Bifrost and a Lear 3. You could play around with tubes. It's still getting up there in terms of expense because you're going over $1,000, but its main competitor in that area is something like Audio GD's R28. Now, the R28 is basically Audio GD's R1 multi-bit DAC, plus an NFB1, but all in one box, and of course -1 transformer. So I thought it'd be interesting to compare both of those. Now, the R28, as I have it set up here, is plugged into the D300 ref as well. So I know that its USB implementation is going to be inferior to the Unison USB, but it's got the older boards. There are some new ladder DAC boards from Audio GD, which I don't have yet, but I am using the new firmware, which is designed to sound like the old, really nice sounding Philips DACs, like the Marantz Project D1, which I reviewed. So it's kind of not quite an accurate comparison, but I wanted to find out how the Schiit Audio multibit sound was compared to the Audio GD multibit sound, and kind of what the difference was going to be in general. Compared to the Bifrost 2 sound, now the Bifrost 2, as I said, compared to the Yggdrasil, is maybe a little bit soft around the edges, kind of takes off maybe the edge off the music, which is nicer with kind of modern music, which can be a bit sharper. But the Audio GD R28 takes that even further to get sound even a little bit more rounded, a little bit kind of warmer, a little bit more bloom, especially in, say, the bass, and a kind of little bit more depth to the sound, a little bit more maybe what you might call musical. On the other hand, that kind of sound that Audio GD has can be sometimes too much of a good thing. And if you like your sound to be, to be more precise, kind of more accurate sounding, then it's kind of less the kind of DAC for you. The Bifrost, of course, sits in the middle between the kind of very precise and almost, in some cases, more dry sounding Yggdrasil and the R28. So that was kind of an interesting comparison. So sometimes I felt like switching backwards and forwards between songs, that the Bifrost was a little bit flatter sounding and the Audio GD a little bit more kind of produced a little bit more depth to the music. But the R28 instead sometimes sounded a little bit too rounded, a little bit too warm, whereas the Bifrost was a little bit more kind of even and kind of kept more of an even keel to their sound. So in comparison, I wouldn't take necessarily one or the other. Both were really good and both were really enjoyable to listen to. But, it's one of those little fine preference things that maybe with certain equipment might be like, say, if you had a very warm sounding tube amp, the Audio GD might be too warm and the Bifrost might be the better option. Also, given that both are balanced out, maybe a high quality balanced amplifier might be the best option for both of those DACs. So maybe the only real negative about the Bifrost 2 is that it leaves a big gap in the Schiit Audio lineup between itself and the much cheaper Modi Multibit. However, for people looking for a good sounding, entry-level high-end DAC, I reckon the Bifrost 2 is certainly good value. Especially if you already had a Bifrost, you can get one for $100 off if you're considering upgrading. And of course, with the modularity, you'll be able to upgrade it in the future without having to spend a lot of money, which you'd have to do if you bought a whole new unit. And the other interesting thing is its kind of spiritual competitor, Audio GD, is actually more expensive, when normally they're well known for having good value digital components. Unless you're one of those people who is a militant objectivist who consider any distortion spikes for a -0 dB tone above -130 dB to be bad and evil, and then, well, there's nothing I can do for you. Still, it's still amazing how Schiit Audio provides really good value for the money, even against their well-known competitors. So especially if you're the kind of person who doesn't need to nitpick the ultra-fine details of the music, maybe you don't have the most high-end gear, or you don't have the most high-end headphones, I reckon the new Bifrost 2 could very much suit you. Especially since it has the new Unison USB, which kind of puts the icing on the cake. So for me, this new Bifrost 2 is going to be something of a benchmark at the $700 level, especially as it combines a kind of middle road between the kind of more musical multi-bit sound, but still performs very technically well, all things considered. Before you go, don't forget that these videos are supported by people such as yourself. If you'd like to join our community of like-minded enthusiasts, in exchange you can get access to my advice anytime, which, considering you'll probably spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on equipment, could save you a lot of money. Also, I have monthly draws for free gear and music discounts available as well. But most importantly, you'll be helping me make these videos. So for that and more, head over to amos.io/join and choose a membership option. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online. Okay, so this is going to go back in, and no. Yeah, what the heck? Can't see where the cards are going in, so it's missing completely. Has to be somewhere in there. Got it. Oh, first time.